Imagine it is March 15th, 2012. You are a 42-year-old school teacher living in Caracas, Venezuela. You wake up each morning at 6, brew coffee in the small kitchen of your apartment, and ride 2 buses to the school where you have taught history for 16 years. Your salary is modest, but it is enough. You earn around 4,000 bolivars a month. That covers rent, food for your 2 children, and even a little extra to put away each month into a savings account at a local bank. You have nearly 60,000 bolivars saved. That is roughly 14,000 US dollars at the current exchange rate. It is your safety net, your children's future. You earned it one slow paycheck at a time over 12 careful years. If you have ever wondered why some currencies suddenly collapse while others survive, stay with me. What you're about to hear is not a theory. It is a pattern. It has happened before. And it always ends the same way. The names change, the countries change, the decade changes, but the mechanics underneath are nearly identical every single time. And if you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. Now, back to Caracas. By the time it is 2018, just 6 years later, your 60,000 bolivars cannot buy a single cup of coffee. Not because the coffee got more expensive in any real sense, but because the currency you trusted, the paper you worked for, the numbers in your bank account, lost more than 99% of their value. Your $14,000 in savings became worth less than a single US cent. Not figuratively, literally. The bolivar did not just decline, it evaporated. It became confetti with printing on it, and the worst part is that almost nobody saw it coming when there was still time to act. But the signs were there. They are always there. This video is about what those signs look like, why currencies collapse, and what happened to the real people who lived through the worst monetary disasters of the past 100 years. Because this is not ancient history. This pattern is alive right now in multiple countries as you listen to these words. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. A currency does not lose 99% of its value because of one bad decision. It is not a single moment. It is a process. Think of it like termites eating through the frame of a house. From the outside, the house looks fine. The walls are standing, the paint is fresh. But inside, the structural beams are being hollowed out slowly, quietly, over months and years. Then one day, someone leans on a wall, and the entire structure folds in on itself. Everyone calls it a sudden collapse. But it was never sudden. It was invisible until it was not. The same thing happens with currencies. The real damage is done long before the crisis makes headlines. It starts with governments spending more money than they take in. This is called a fiscal deficit, which simply means the government writes checks it cannot cover with tax revenue alone. To fill the gap, the government borrows. When lenders stop lending because they no longer trust they will be paid back, the government turns to its central bank and says, print more money. The central bank creates new currency out of thin air. This floods the economy with money that is not backed by any real increase in goods or services. When there is more money chasing the same amount of stuff, prices go up. When governments keep printing, prices go up faster. And when they cannot stop printing, because stopping would mean admitting they are bankrupt, prices go up so fast that the money becomes meaningless. That is the mechanism. Spend beyond your means. Borrow until no one will lend. Print until the paper is worthless. It sounds simple. It is simple. And yet, it has destroyed the savings of hundreds of millions of people across dozens of countries in the last century alone. The termites do not care whether the house is in Berlin, Buenos Aires, or Beirut. This brings us directly to one of the most dramatic currency collapses in modern history. Germany, 1923, the Weimar Republic. After losing World War I, Germany was forced to pay enormous war reparations, which are payments demanded by the winning countries to cover the costs of the war. These payments were set at 132 billion gold marks, an amount so large that many economists at the time said it was unpayable. Germany tried. The government taxed its people heavily. It borrowed from foreign banks. But the debt was suffocating. By 1921, the government began printing money to meet its obligations. At first, the effects were subtle. Prices crept up. A loaf of bread that cost around 1 mark in 1919 cost roughly 4 marks by early 1922. People grumbled, but life continued. Then the printing accelerated. By January 1923, that same loaf of bread cost 250 marks. By September, it cost 1.5 million marks. And by November 1923, a single loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. The numbers are almost impossible to process. Workers were paid twice a day because if they waited until the end of the day, their morning wages would already be worthless. People carried cash in wheelbarrows. A famous photograph from that era shows children playing with stacks of banknotes as building blocks because the paper was worth less as money than as a toy. An elderly woman named Frau Eisenmenger, whose diary survived the period, wrote about watching her life savings, enough to live comfortably for 20 years, become insufficient to buy a single newspaper. She had done everything right. She had saved faithfully. She had trusted the system. And the system consumed her. The German paper mark lost effectively 100% of its value in under 2 years. The government eventually introduced a new currency, the Rentenmark, in November 1923 to stabilize the economy. But for millions of ordinary Germans, the damage was done. Their savings were gone. Their trust in institutions was shattered. And that broken trust created a vacuum that darker political forces would soon fill. This leads to the second part of this story, because what happened in Weimar Germany was not a one-time accident. The same script played out decades later on another continent, with different actors, but the same tragic plot. Here is something I want you to think about before we go further. If you had lived through the early stages of one of these collapses, when prices were rising but life still felt mostly normal, would you have recognized the warning signs? Or would you have done what most people do, which is assume that things would go back to normal because they always had before? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously. Because what I am about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never hear. And it changes everything. Zimbabwe. The year is 2000. President Robert Mugabe's government launches a controversial land reform program, seizing white-owned commercial farms and redistributing them. Whatever the political arguments for or against the policy, the economic consequences were immediate and devastating. These commercial farms produced the majority of Zimbabwe's agricultural exports, particularly tobacco, which was the country's largest source of foreign currency. Within 2 years, agricultural output collapsed by roughly 50%. Export revenues dried up. The government's tax base shrank dramatically. But government spending did not shrink. If anything, it grew. Mugabe's administration was funding a costly military intervention in the Democratic Republic of Congo, paying off political allies and expanding the public payroll. The gap between what the government earned and what it spent became a canyon, and the government filled that canyon the only way it could. It printed money. The Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe, the country's central bank, began producing Zimbabwean dollars at an accelerating pace. Inflation, which had been around 30% in 1998, already high by global standards, climbed to 55% in 2000, then 100% in 2003. By 2006, it exceeded 1,000%. And then it went parabolic, which means it shot upward at an almost vertical angle, like a rocket. By November 2008, Zimbabwe's inflation rate reached an estimated 79.6 billion% per month. That is not a typo. 79.6 billion%. Prices were doubling approximately every 24 hours. A $100 trillion banknote was printed, and it could barely buy a bus ticket. People stopped using the currency entirely. They turned to barter, trading eggs, for soap, or they used foreign currencies like the US dollar and the South African rand. A retired civil servant named Peter McConey, profiled in a 2009 report by the Institute for War and Peace Reporting, described how his pension, which he had paid into for 31 years, could not buy a single box of matches by the time the collapse was complete. 31 years of contributions, 31 years of trusting the system, worth less than a matchstick. The Zimbabwean dollar was officially abandoned in 2009. The government simply gave up on its own currency. And in the ashes of that monetary destruction, those who had held US dollars, gold, or physical assets like livestock and property found themselves in a completely different position from those who had trusted paper savings. Now here's where it gets interesting. Because the pattern does not only appear in countries run by authoritarian regimes or torn apart by war, it appears in places that look stable. Places with shopping malls and universities and functioning court systems. Places where people post vacation photos and complain about traffic. Places that feel modern and safe, like Argentina. Argentina is one of the most fascinating and heartbreaking case studies in monetary history because it has lived through this cycle not once, not twice, but repeatedly over the past 50 years. The Argentine peso has been replaced, renamed, or redenominated, which means the government knocked zeros off the currency to make the numbers smaller, at least 5 times since 1970. In the early 1980s, the peso was replaced by the peso argentino. Then the peso argentino was replaced by the austral. Then the austral was replaced by the current peso. Each time, the old currency had been destroyed by inflation. But the period that most clearly echoes the pattern we are studying came between 1989 and 1990. In 1989, Argentina's inflation rate hit approximately 3,079% for the year. In 1990, it reached about 2,114%. The peso lost more than 99% of its purchasing power, which simply means its ability to buy things in just over 12 months. Supermarkets changed price stickers multiple times per day. Some stores stopped listing prices altogether and just shouted new numbers over the loudspeaker every few hours. A former bank employee named Graciela Fernandez, interviewed in a 2002 documentary about the crisis, described how she went to the bank on a Monday morning to withdraw money for groceries and was told her savings account balance, which had been the equivalent of $8,000 3 months earlier, could now purchase roughly 20 kilograms of rice. She stood in the bank lobby and cried, not because she was dramatic, because she understood in that moment that every hour of overtime, every sacrificed vacation, every birthday present she did not buy for herself so she could put the money away, all of it had been erased. The mechanism was identical to Germany and Zimbabwe. Government spending that far exceeded revenue. Political unwillingness to make difficult budget cuts. A central bank turned into a printing press for politicians, and ordinary people left holding currency that melted in their hands like ice under a heat lamp. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people will keep trusting systems they do not understand, not because they are foolish, but because they were never taught to look beneath the surface. If you are still here, you're not most people. Hit subscribe, because the next section is the part this channel was made for, the part they never put in textbooks. Now look at all three together. Germany in 1923, Zimbabwe in 2008, Argentina in 1989 and 1990. 3 different continents, 3 different political systems, 3 different decades. And yet the underlying structure is identical in every single case. Step 1, the government spends far more than it collects. Step 2, it borrows to cover the gap until creditors lose confidence and stop lending. Step 3, the central bank prints new money to fill the hole. Step 4, inflation begins to rise, slowly at first, then faster, then uncontrollably. Step 5, the currency loses virtually all of its value. Step 6, ordinary savers are wiped out while those with hard assets or foreign currency survive. The same mechanism, the same sequence, the same result, every time. And here's the part that should make you uncomfortable. This is not a historical curiosity. It is a living pattern. Venezuela, which we opened this video with, followed the exact same playbook between 2012 and 2020. The Bolivar lost over 99.9% of its value. The International Monetary Fund estimated Venezuela's inflation rate at approximately 1,300,000% in 2018. 1,300,000%. The government redenominated the currency 3 times between 2008 and 2021, removing 14 zeros in total from the Bolivar. 14 zeros. Each redenomination was an admission that the previous version of the currency had been destroyed. In Lebanon, starting in 2019, began its own version of this cycle. The Lebanese pound, which had been pegged, meaning fixed, to the US dollar at 107 pounds per dollar since 1997, collapsed to over 90,000 pounds per dollar on the parallel market by 2023. That is a loss of over 98%. Lebanese citizens watched their bank deposits become inaccessible. Some literally broke into their own banks with guns to demand their own savings. Not criminal savings, not illicit. Money. Just ordinary people's paychecks and retirement funds trapped behind locked doors and frozen accounts. The pattern is not random. It is not unpredictable. It is mechanical. It works the same way every time because the underlying forces, too much debt, too much printing, too little discipline, are human forces. And human nature does not change across centuries or borders. And this is where history gets uncomfortable. Because in every single one of these collapses, the pain was not distributed equally. The suffering followed a very specific gradient, like water flowing downhill. It always hit the same people hardest. Middle-class savers, pensioners, government employees, small business owners who held cash reserves in local currency, teachers, nurses, factory workers, anyone whose wealth was denominated in, meaning measured and stored in, the local currency. These people were wiped out, not because they made bad decisions, but because they made the decision that is supposed to be the safe one. They saved, they put money in the bank, they trusted government bonds, they held cash, and every single one of those supposedly safe choices turned into a trapdoor. Meanwhile, a different group came through these periods with their wealth intact, or even expanded. In Weimar Germany, industrialists who owned factories, land, and physical commodities actually saw their debts shrink in real terms because they owed money in a currency that was becoming worthless. The great industrialist Hugo Stinnes became one of the richest men in Germany during hyperinflation by borrowing heavily in marks to buy real assets like mines, newspapers, and shipping companies. As the mark collapsed, his debts evaporated, while his assets held their real value. In Zimbabwe, those who had converted their savings into US dollars before the crisis, or who held physical gold, or who owned agricultural land that could produce food, survived. A farmer, outside Harare with 50 head of cattle and a borehole for water, was in a fundamentally different position than a retired civil servant with a pension denominated in Zimbabwean dollars. The cattle were still cattle. The water was still water. But the pension was just numbers on paper that meant nothing. In Argentina, the wealthy who had moved money to bank accounts in Miami or Montevideo before the worst of the crisis were largely unaffected. The poor and the middle class, who could not access international banking and whose entire financial existence was inside the Argentine system, bore the full force of the collapse. This is perhaps the cruelest aspect of currency crises. They are regressive, which means they hit those with the least resources the hardest, while those with the most resources have the means and the knowledge to escape. The floor gives way, but not everyone is standing on the same floor. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only question is whether you will see it before it sees you. If this channel helps you think differently about the world you live in, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it might change everything. Now, what did the survivors do? Not the billionaires, not the politically connected, the ordinary people who came through these collapses without losing everything. The historical record shows that those who came through these periods largely shared three characteristics. The first was diversification. Across currencies. This does not mean they were financial experts. It means that in many cases, they simply held some of their savings in a more stable foreign currency, often the US dollar, the Swiss franc, or later the euro. In Venezuela, families that kept even modest amounts of US dollars hidden in their homes or in foreign bank accounts maintained purchasing power while their neighbors believe our savings evaporated. This was not sophisticated finance. It was basic survival. Instinct. The second characteristic was ownership of tangible assets, which means things you can touch and use. Land. A house, livestock. A small business that sold something people needed, regardless of what the currency was doing. In every single hyperinflation, from Germany to Zimbabwe to Argentina, physical assets maintained their value in real terms, even as paper currency became worthless. A house in Buenos Aires was still a house before, during, and after the peso collapsed. Its price in pesos might have changed wildly, but its actual value as shelter did not. The third characteristic was early action. This is the most painful one to talk about because it involves a kind of awareness that most people simply do not have until it is too late. In nearly every case study, there was a window of time, sometimes a few years, sometimes just months, where the warning signs were visible, but the full collapse had not yet arrived. Those who acted during that window, by converting currency, by acquiring hard assets, by reducing their dependence on the local financial system, were dramatically better off than those who waited. The challenge, of course, is that during that window, acting feels paranoid. Everyone around you is still going to work, still putting money in the bank, still trusting the system. Acting differently means standing apart from the crowd. It means questioning what everyone else seems to accept. And that is one of the hardest things a human being can do. We are social creatures. We take our cues from the group. And in the early stages of a currency crisis, the group is almost always wrong. Not because individuals are stupid, but because the signals are designed, sometimes deliberately, to reassure. Governments issue calming statements. Central banks announce stability measures. Television news features economists who explain why this time is different. The wallpaper keeps looking fine. The termites keep eating. Let me take you back now to Caracas, to our school teacher. She did not convert her savings. She did not buy dollars on the informal market when it was still possible and relatively affordable. She did not invest in property or hard assets, not because she was negligent, but because no one she knew did those things, because her bank told her everything was fine, because the government said the economy was strong and the revolution was prospering. By 2017, her 60,000 bolivars was nominally still in her account, but the currency had been redenominated. The zeros had been slashed. And even after redenomination, what remained could not buy a week of groceries. She began selling her furniture to feed her children. First the dining table, then the bookshelf her father had built, then her late mother's sewing machine. By 2018, she was no longer teaching. The school was effectively closed because there was no money for supplies, and most families had pulled their children out to send them to work. She joined the more than 7 million Venezuelans who fled the country, walking across the border into Colombia with 2 bags and her children. Her 12 years of savings existed now only as a lesson about what happens when trust in a currency is misplaced, a lesson about the gap between what we are told and what is true, a lesson about the quiet, invisible process by which a currency dies while everyone watches television and eats dinner and assumes tomorrow will look like today. This is not a story designed to frighten you. It is a story designed to inform you. Currency collapses are not random natural disasters. They follow a predictable sequence driven by identifiable causes. Excessive government spending financed by money printing is the engine. Political unwillingness to accept short-term pain is the fuel. And public trust, the last pillar holding the whole structure up, is always the final thing to break. When it breaks fast. Today, there are countries running fiscal deficits that would have been considered emergency level a generation ago. Global government debt stands at over $307 trillion as of early 2024, according to the Institute of International Finance. Multiple nations have debt to GDP ratios, which means the size of their debts compared to the size of their economies exceeding 100%. Central banks around the world expanded their balance sheets dramatically during the pandemic era of 2020 through 2022, creating trillions of dollars, euros, pounds, and yen. Whether any of this leads to the kind of collapses we have discussed is not something anyone can predict with certainty. History does not repeat in exact copies, but it does rhyme. The melodies are familiar, the instruments are the same, and the audience, ordinary people going about their ordinary lives, is always the last to hear the music change. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different. Please consult a qualified professional before making any financial decision. This video is not for everyone. Most people will dismiss it. They will say it could never happen here. Wherever here is for them. But if one person in your life needs to hear this, share it with them. Not because it will change the world, because it might change their world. Subscribe for more, and I will see you in the next one.